Thank all of you. Here we go. Now the recording has started. And if there are any technical issues, if you can't hear us or if anything's going on that is preventing that or for you to seeing the screen and whatnot, just let us know in the chat and we'll try and help you with that. But otherwise, I'd like to welcome you to Asthma Canada's speaker series. This is actually the first webinar presentation that we've offered for this year. We've had several in the past. And of course, our topic today is focusing on clinical trials. So this webinar is, of course, for people in our community that have a connection to asthma, but the topic is certainly broad and one that is applicable to the entire health system as a whole. So I know we have some healthcare professionals that have signed up, people from industry signed up to join us today and receive the recording afterwards. So I want to welcome all of you, and including those from potentially other patient groups that might be viewing this webinar live or recorded as well. And thank you for joining us, whether it's your first time or whether you're a regular attendee to the Asthma Speaker Series webinars. My name is Jeff Beach, and I'm the President and CEO of Asthma Canada. And it's my pleasure to be your host and moderator for this session today. I'll introduce our presenter, our guest expert in a moment, but I just want to go through a few things with you before we officially turn it over to Don. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, we take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. I'm coming to you from the region of Peel in Ontario, which is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We recognize that those joining us are doing so from various lands and territories. For thousands of years, the Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for these lands and still continue to do so today. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and by doing so, give our respect to its first inhabitants. Just a few housekeeping points that I'd like to cover. As I mentioned earlier, for those that joined us originally, the webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to our website shortly. So when it does get posted, we would ask that you please share it. This, as I mentioned, is a topic that is applicable and of interest to many people, not just from the asthma community, from different patient communities as well. So please share. All attendees are muted at this point, but if you have questions or comments, please type them either into the chat box, or we invite you to use the Q&A feature that you see across either the top or the bottom of your screen. And by doing so, we'll be able to address your questions with Dawn after she finishes speaking. I do want to thank those that provided questions and submitted them in advance. We had some really good questions come in that Dawn has used to help inform her as she was preparing for this webinar, and also we'll address some of those during the Q&A. There were some questions that were posted by people that were not clinical trial related, but rather about asthma and different asthma related topics. So if you have questions along those lines, we won't be covering those today. That's not Dawn's area of expertise, which is clinical trials. So we will, but we are always here to answer those questions. So we'll provide some information a little bit later on in the session around our asthma helpline and how you can reach us to have access to all the information and answer any questions that you may have. Want to just very quickly, sorry, I had a slide for land acknowledgement there. I want to just speak very quickly about Asthma Canada and highlight some of our work. We are committed to improving the lives of the Canadian asthma community through education and support services, as well as advocacy and research. So we encourage self-management by helping our community take control of their symptoms. We do this through our educational resources and services like our asthma and allergy helpline, as well as offerings like this webinar here today. Our website is asthma.ca, and it contains a wealth of credible and evidence-based information that is available to you anytime you need it. We're also committed to bringing your voice to the forefront of policy decisions that affect our community, advocating on important issues such as clean, sustainable clean air, clean energy, and the choice and access to treatments that help people live better lives. Of course, at Asthma Canada, we also support research, and we invest in research that is being conducted in Canada by graduate level students studying early and late onset asthma. So we invite you to learn more about this and all our programs through our website at asthma.ca. And finally, I want to put in a quick plug for the Asthma Canada Member Alliance. Much of the work that we do through our community of volunteers and members across the country is made possible because of our Member Alliance. And this involves people living with asthma, their families, parents, and others who are strongly committed to improving asthma care and quality of life. So we encourage everyone to sign up for a free membership. This will give you access to direct information right into your inbox through our ACMA blasts that are sent out on a monthly basis, and other updates and information, and opportunities to be involved in some of the advocacy initiatives and other priorities that we're working on. So we encourage, if you haven't already done so, please take a moment, sign up for the Asthma Canada Member Alliance, and we'd love to connect with you. So finally, I am very pleased to introduce our guest and our presenter today, Dr. Dawn Richards. Dawn is the Director of Patient and Public Engagement at Clinical Trials Ontario, with a PhD in analytical chemistry from the University of Alberta and experience in a variety of roles over the past 20 years. It was her diagnosis with rheumatoid arthritis 15 years ago that started her journey to combine her passion for science with making the most of her diagnosis. Dawn advocates for disease awareness, access to treatment and research options, and including patients as partners on research teams and in decision-making. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Dawn, and I'll pass the presentation over to you. I'll stop sharing my screen and you can start sharing yours. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jeff. And it's really my pleasure to be here today chatting with all of you. Just make sure I can get this into slideshow first. There we go. So Jeff had asked me to talk about the basics of clinical trials today. And as he mentioned, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is really applicable independent of the disease area. I will touch on a few things about asthma trials, but I'm going to keep things fairly high level overall, just as more of an introduction than anything. So I'll talk about some specific basics. I'll help you out if you're interested in actually looking for a clinical trial. And we're going to end the presentation with talking a bit about your rights as a participant. Especially this is important if you're considering participation and understanding, that you can actually leave a trial at any time, even if you have consented to participate originally. So we're going to talk a bit about that too. Now, as Jeff had mentioned, I do work for an organization called Clinical Trials Ontario, and we are primarily funded by the government of Ontario. You can read what's here, but basically our role is to make Ontario a better place to do clinical trials. As was mentioned, the strategic pillar that I run at CTO is the Engage pillar. And so it's my job to help people like yourselves understand about clinical trials, maybe make an informed decision about participating, or maybe find out how you might be part of an actual trial team that's designing and running a clinical trial. And importantly, I wanted to let you know that although my organization is based in Ontario, everything that I'll talk to you about today is applicable to trials all across Canada. So trials are regulated nationally by Health Canada. And so therein, as I talk about things, everything I'll talk about is applicable to a trial anywhere in Canada. The other thing I just wanted to put a plug in is we do have a lot of information on the Clinical Trials Ontario website, and specifically the drop down here, which is featured, is the web pages for patients and the public. And I wanted to let people know that those have all been designed with people who live with various conditions, or who are caregivers to those who have health conditions, or who are simply interested in clinical trials. So we're not just a bunch of academics swooping in and giving you information, but I actually work really closely with members of patients in the public in everything that I do at CTO. The information in our patient and public pages is also available in both English and French. So I know that obviously our country has a large French-speaking population, and happy for you to share that with folks too. Specifically, the things I'm going to talk about and more are part of our website under a section called Learn More About Clinical Trials. This portion of our website has been designed with members of what's called now our College of Lived Experience. And so these are people that I work with who bring their lived experience and expertise to the table and who guide me in my work at CTO. And they specifically said when we started to build our website, you know, I'm interested in finding out specific information about clinical trials, depending on where I am in my decision-making process. So that's how you see things laid out on the website. There's just a general, you know, I'm interested in learning about clinical trials. I've moved on and I'm actually considering and looking for a clinical trial. Oh, look, I found a trial I'm interested in. What are some of the things I might consider? And then if I'm actually in a clinical trial, like what might I expect and what are some of the things for me to know or consider? And then even when you've finished a clinical trial, there might be specific questions you have or things that you're interested in. So that's how we've set up the website. And we've also developed a glossary about clinical trials that's available on the website too. The website isn't just text. There's also a few videos from experts in our community too. And so there's a video from a dermatologist who conducts clinical trials. There's also information about research ethics boards from an individual who's been very involved in the research ethics world for many years. So just to let you know about that, and happy for you to check it out. Okay, so let's get things rolling. And as Jeff mentioned, feel free to type any questions that you have in the Q&A, and we're going to take some time at the end to answer some of those questions for you. So let's start off with the basics about clinical trials. So maybe you've got some preconceived notions about them. These are some of the so-called facts. It's important to know that clinical trials are a type of research. They test what we call health-related interventions and outcomes. You can think of intervention as just a fancy word for treatment or therapy. So we basically are testing health-related treatments or therapies. And we specifically design clinical trials to answer specific questions. And we've got some questions here. And as we go a little bit deeper into the presentation, we'll talk about some of the other questions that we design clinical trials to answer. But importantly, they might answer questions like, is the treatment even safe in people? Does the treatment improve or cure a disease? Or maybe it helps people live longer with that disease than other treatments that are available. And maybe the intervention helps people feel better. Maybe it improves their quality of life. So those are some of the questions that we design clinical trials to answer. I know we often, or in many cases, I think people tend to think about the therapies that are studied in clinical trials as drugs, and they often are, but it's also important for you to be aware, and this was actually a question that came in, is, you know, do other things besides drugs get studied in clinical trials? And the answer to that is yes. So they might be devices. Maybe it's a type of inhaler, for example, or maybe it's an insulin pump. It might be a new type of surgery. It might be a type of radiation therapy. It might be a diagnostic procedure, like a new imaging procedure or something like that. And it can even be things like diet and lifestyle. So it might be a specific diet for a specific condition. It might be an exercise study for a specific condition. So just to let you know, there's lots of different therapies or treatments that can be studied in clinical trials. I am going to focus a great deal of the presentation on drugs, simply because that's probably a little bit easier than delving into each of these different interventions. So why do we even do clinical trials is another question that we often get. And the most basic answer is we do that to provide research data or evidence about a therapy. So we help build the evidence around a specific therapy by doing different types of trials. And ultimately, that helps a number of different people decide what therapies or other interventions might work best for people. And the data from clinical trials doesn't just help the researchers who are doing this study, although it can help researchers and the organizations or sponsors that fund the clinical trial decide if they want to continue studying that intervention. It helps Health Canada by providing them the evidence to decide if the intervention is safe and effective for it to be provided at a wide scale to Canadians. It helps policymakers and decision makers decide on, for example, what might be funded by our healthcare system, or even how treatment of specific conditions may happen or change. So they can help feed into treatment guidelines and other things. So the evidence that's generated can really help a number of people make decisions about a specific type of intervention or therapy. So we do, as I mentioned, design clinical trials to help us answer specific questions. They're highly regulated and they have some methodology around them. And so I'm going to walk you through the different phases of clinical trials for drugs. And they're kind of briefly shown here is that we start out at phase 1. It's with a smaller number of people. And important to note that things may or may not move on to the next phase that's shown in this diagram. And that can be dependent on a number of things. It can be dependent on who's funding the study. It can be dependent on the results of the study. Sometimes things are stopped early for good or not so good reasons and moved on or not moved on. So there's a lot that's not behind this slide, and I'll talk you through some of that. The other thing to consider is that when people are in these different phases of studies, they're closely monitored throughout the studies themselves. So they're regularly in contact with the people that are doing the clinical trial. In some cases, they're more closely monitored, like they might be at a site for phase 1 studies. And again, we'll walk through some of these. So phase 1 clinical trials for drugs are in a small number of individuals. These you may hear called first in human, and that is because this is the first time, in this case, the drug is given to people. Important to remember, though, that once things get to clinical trials, they've often been studied for many years in the laboratory setting. They may have been in animal models. They may have been studied in cell and other types of models. So the researchers know a lot about the drug before it goes into people. There's a really good sense that this will be safe in people. However, we don't know until we test it out in people. So sometimes called first in humans, and this is why we look at a small number of participants in this phase as well. We don't want to put this for the first time in thousands of people. We want it in a really tightly controlled setting. And here it's really about, is this safe for people to take? And as I mentioned, the idea before it gets here is that it should be safe, but we can never be sure until it goes into people. We have an idea of what the dose should be, but here we're again, carefully looking at what the dose should be for people. And we're monitoring for side effects, and that's all part of safety, really. These, again, small number of participants, the phase is usually not in terms of time that long either. Sometimes you might hear about participants being paid for their participation in studies. That's usually phase 1 studies where the research ethics board will deem that it's ethical to provide payment to people here who are taking a bigger risk than other participants, as this is the first time that the drug is provided to people. So let's assume that things go well in phase 1 and the researcher and or the sponsor decide to move the drug into the next phase. I'm also talking about each of the phases as if there's a 1, 2, 3, 4. You might hear in the case of rare diseases, sometimes the phases can be combined because there are so few participants that are available. And sometimes in cancer studies, you'll see different combinations of the phases. But here we're just talking generally, so I'm going to break them down as to what the typical scenario would be. So if the drug continues on into phase 2, so it's, successfully achieved its phase 1 endpoint of being, in this case, safe, it will go into a phase 2 study. We're looking here at hundreds of people in this case. And here the design is established to make sure that this does what it's actually supposed to do, and that's efficacy. So does it do what it's supposed to do in terms of the disease that it's being developed for? We continue to learn more about dose, and side effects are always monitored throughout the different phases. So in phase 1, sometimes you'll hear people talked about as healthy controls. And so phase 1 studies usually are in people that don't have the disease for which the drug is intended. In phase 2, this is where you start to generally see people who live with the condition that the drug is intended for. So larger number of participants in phase 2, and they usually take a bit longer than the phase 1 studies, partly because there's more people in them. So let's assume everything again has gone great in phase 2 and the researchers or the funders decide that they will move this drug into phase 3 studies. Okay, so phase 3 studies, this is where we're now looking at thousands of participants. So large scale study. This is where you sometimes hear about things called randomized controlled trials. This is where people are assigned by chance to one of the interventions, and that helps to reduce bias in the interpretation of the data and or the results. Here, the phase of AIM-3 is to look at how long the effects of, in this case, the drug lasts. We continue to understand more about dose. We continue to understand about any other side effects, especially as the drug continues to be used in a larger number of people. We'll better understand the side effects. So for a large number of participants, and as I mentioned, a randomized clinical trial is when we actually compare 2 or more treatments in what's called treatment arms to each other. So in phase 3, you might have someone that's taking the new drug, and you'd have that compared to a standard of care if there's already a standard of care available for that particular condition, or it may be a placebo if there's not a standard of care. So part of that design really depends on what's available for that particular condition. So sometimes you'll hear of randomized clinical trials being considered like the gold standard for providing evidence about, in this case, a drug. After phase 3 in Canada, the sponsor or the researcher can apply to Health Canada for approval for, in this case, the drug to be marketed. So that's where Health Canada will look at all of the data and decide if it can become widely available and marketed to people in Canada. So phase 4 clinical trials for drugs, this is when at this point that in Canada, Health Canada has approved the drug for wide scale access by people in Canada. And so this is often called post-marketing surveillance. So it's approved to be marketed to Canadians, but it may be actively surveilled in tens of thousands of people if it becomes, this isn't a rare disease in this case, when it becomes widely available to a lot of people. And this is where we're able to look at side effects and long-term side effects in really tens of thousands of people. So again, for a very large number of participants. So sometimes we get asked questions about placebo, and I've actually mentioned placebo being something that may be used in phase 3 studies. What's important about placebo is it's an inactive therapy. So in the case of a drug, it looks exactly like the active drug that's being trialed, but it has no effect on the condition that's being studied. So sometimes people call this like a sugar pill. So it looks exactly like what is under investigation, but it doesn't have any effect on the condition being studied. And just like randomization, this is used to make the results of the study more reliable. As I also mentioned, the use of placebo is something that happens only if there's not a standard of care for a condition or a disease already. And so otherwise it wouldn't be ethical to have people randomized against placebo if there is a good therapy that's already available that a new therapy is being compared to. Okay, so now you're kind of armed with the basics about clinical trials. Let's talk about how people actually find clinical trials if they're interested. So these are some of the most obvious resources. You might want to talk to your healthcare provider about clinical trials. They might be involved with a clinical trial or with a clinical trials group. They might have colleagues who are, or they might just be in the know. You could ask an organization like Asthma Canada. They are often in the know about what is happening research-wise within their community, and especially in the Canadian landscape, they often have connections to scientific and medical experts who are doing clinical research. You might contact a hospital or another organization that does research and ask them. They will often have a specific part of their website about research and often some credible resources around questions that people often ask or things to consider about participation in research. You might hear or see ads in the newspaper, TV, or radio. Many times those are for phase 1 studies because you'll often hear about payment being made to participate in those, but those are legitimate. And then I'll put a plug out for our clinical trial finder that we have developed with patients and members of the public. Our clinical trial finder actually pulls from a database in the US that's it's often referred to simply as clinicaltrials.gov, and it's a database where trialists and companies register their trials that are either ongoing or for which they will be soon recruiting, or even they might still be there after the trial is done. So our finder pulls daily from clinicaltrials.gov, and the only thing that's different is we've made the user interface a lot friendlier and easier to navigate than what you would see at clinicaltrials.gov. So these are just some of the kind of main places you might go to look for a trial. Doesn't mean there aren't others, but these are some of the more common ones. We often get asked about how do I determine if a clinical trial is actually reputable or credible? That's a great question, and we've got some tips for you to think about if you find a trial that you think you might be interested in and want to do some homework on. So one of the things is that the costs of the clinical trial, for example, the study treatment or the intervention, should be covered. I recently was asked by someone to take a look at a clinical trial that they were interested in, and it said right up front that they were expected to pay thousands of dollars for access to the study treatment. That is a giant red flag. So is being asked to pay, for example, a participation fee. That should just not be something that happens. It's not ethical. So you might have to pay things out of pocket like parking, maybe transportation costs if you have to go to a site. Maybe you have to take time off work. But in some cases, transportation might be covered, gas might be covered, and those kinds of things. So again, these are things for you to think about and ask about, but really that main red flag is there a so-called entrance fee? And are you being asked to potentially pay for the study treatment? Another thing to look at is the qualifications of the clinical trial team. So is this a group that has worked and done research in this area for a number of years, or is it an esteemed physician or dentist who's running the trial? Maybe they're affiliated with an academic center. That's not always the case, but that's something to look at. Clinical trials in Canada have to be reviewed by a regulatory agency. So in our case, that's Health Canada. And you can ask, and that information should be provided to you. Has the clinical trial been reviewed and approved by a research ethics board? So all trials at sites do need to be reviewed and approved. Sorry if there's, are there sirens in the background, Jeff? I'm not sure if okay, good, there's not. So has the trial been reviewed and approved by Research Ethics Board? This will be available on the informed consent form if you get to that stage. If you don't, again, this is another thing you can simply ask about when you start to ask some questions about the study. And then there's liabilities potential liabilities associated with hosting a clinical trial as an institution or organization. And so that institution or organization also has to review and approve the clinical trial that's taking place on their site. So some of these you might think, oh, I feel kind of weird asking about these, but these are for sure all things that you should feel very comfortable asking a trial team about if you're interested in a study. On top of this, if you continue to be interested in the study and you feel like it meets these criteria for you, determining if a trial is the right trial or a good trial for you. So you can kind of look at all the same things. You might also look at how participation is going to affect you. Like if there are lots of site visits, if you have to take lots of time off work, those types of things. But the other thing is you actually need to meet something that's called eligibility to be in the clinical trial. And you can kind of think of eligibility as qualifications that you need to meet to be in this study. And that might be something like living with a specific condition or disease, like maybe it's asthma, or maybe it's mild asthma, or something like that. It might be your age range. Sometimes that's part of eligibility criteria. You may need to live in a specific location. You may need to be a specific sex. So there's usually a number of eligibility criteria that are listed out even if you've determined, yeah, I'm okay with all these other things, you'll have to see if you meet these eligibility criteria. And sometimes there's also things that sort of disqualify you from being able to participate. Like it might be having been on or being on a certain type of medication or something like that. So as you dig deeper with your interest related to a clinical trial, you'll kind of get narrower and narrower and see the other pieces that you have to meet in order to be considered to be a participant for the trial. So it's not my job to convince you to be part of a clinical trial. That's one option for you. I see my job as providing you with all the information that can help you make the best decision for you. And this is really a personal decision that I would argue no one else can make for you. So there are other options. One might be not receiving treatment. Another option might be receiving standard treatment, or maybe the treatment that you're on for if you're living with a condition you feel is not working for you, and maybe there's another option in terms of treatments for you. Maybe it's simply participating in a different kind of research study. So clinical trials aren't the only types of research to consider. There are other types of research to think about. And I would encourage you to talk to a healthcare provider about potential known benefits and risks of these options if you're considering them, including no treatment. And, they're a really good source of information to help you weigh potential benefits and risks of some of these options. So what if you are really interested in a clinical trial, but you can't find one, or you can't find one near you? So there may be opportunities if clinical trials are in locations where you are not located, and maybe that's an eligibility criteria. There might be ways that you can still participate. And that might be something as simple as contacting the study team to see if that actually is a possibility. And, how would this affect you if you're interested in participating in a study that's not close to home? So I've chatted with all kinds of people who honestly have paid for out-of-pocket travel outside of the country regularly because they feel like that's a really good option for them. Sometimes travel can get covered, and it may be worth asking. That might mean a lot of time off work. It might mean a lot of out-of-pocket costs, but those are things really to explore if you are interested. There may actually be ways to bring the clinical trial closer to you. I won't lie to you, some of these might be fairly labor intensive, but I've also talked with people who have made that a reality. They've worked with people and organizations to bring trial sites to areas that are closer to them. And honestly, the pandemic has really kind of opened the gates and the discussions around what's called decentralized clinical trials and the possibilities for people to participate outside of kind of a main site who maybe normally wouldn't be able to participate. So it's worth talking about and asking questions about that. And then I also know other people who've been really interested in a specific clinical trial. They've watched it open up in other countries. They've kept their eyes on it, and it has come to Canada after it started in other places, and they've been able to participate. So it might be as simple as keeping up to date on the research that you're interested in and checking from time to time about clinical trials that are available to you. So those are some of the kind of obvious options if you can't find a clinical trial. I'm sure there are also some others too. We often get asked, if my healthcare provider, who I really trust and I really value their advice, offers me a clinical trial, do I have to say yes? And I realize that's sometimes a difficult scenario, but you can definitely say no if your healthcare provider offers you a clinical trial and you simply feel that's not the right option for you or not at that time. Your relationship with that provider should not change, no matter what you decide about the trial. So your participation in the trial is, not tied to your healthcare at all. And as I mentioned earlier, being in a clinical trial is a really personal decision that really only you can make. Okay, so let's move on to the last part of the presentation, which is really helping you be aware of some of your rights as a trial participant. And that also includes the right to withdraw from a clinical trial at any time for any reason. So first, I want to talk about this concept of informed consent. And a lot of people see informed consent and think, oh yeah, I sign a consent form at the start of the study. But informed consent is actually a process that doesn't end while you're in a study. The informed consent form, or the consent form, is a part of the informed consent process. And that consent form has all the information that you should need to know about participation. And you should ask tons and tons of questions about that if you have questions. But it's really important to know that apart from the informed consent form, your consent to be in a clinical trial is voluntary. So it's totally up to you. You can withdraw your consent at any time. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slides. And as I mentioned, consent is an ongoing process. So while the informed consent form and understanding that, agreeing to it, and signing it is one part of informed consent, consent is ongoing throughout the study. So you should always feel like you're comfortable with what's going on, what your responsibilities are, what's being asked of you. And it's also very normal to ask lots of questions during your participation. If you do decide to withdraw your consent, you can also request that any data that you've provided or any samples that you provided, like maybe it's tissue, maybe it's urine, maybe it's blood, etc. You can ask for those to be withdrawn from the study as well. Depending on the study design and where the study is, that may or may not be possible, but it's certainly something that is within your right to request. I touch on this a little bit. There are always potential benefits and risks associated with your participation. This will be, I think, a big part of you making a decision about participation. And it's really up to you to decide if you feel like the potential benefits would outweigh the potential risks for your participation. These potential benefits and risks will be different for each clinical trial, and they will be described in the informed consent form. And as I mentioned, the informed consent form is usually a fairly large document that's provided to potential participants. And it is usually someone from the trial team will sit down and chat with you through it and be available to ask or answer lots of questions for you. Often the informed consent too is provided to you to take away, read, think about. You're often not asked to sign it right then and there. And so you can spend a lot of time making notes on it, thinking about it, talking to whoever is important to you to talk to about it. And as I mentioned a number of times, you should really feel comfortable asking questions about potential benefits and risks related to participation until you feel like you're okay with the answers that you get, that you're satisfied with the answers you get. Okay, next is this concept of withdrawal. And so I've talked about the fact that you can leave a clinical trial at any time. And you don't need to provide a reason. You might be asked for a reason, but you don't have to provide a reason at all. You really are encouraged to chat with the study doctor or the staff or whoever on the team you really trust about your decision. Ask lots of questions about it before you make the decision. again, just like participation in the clinical trial, withdrawal is very personal. And so it's really up to you to seek the information you need to make a decision about withdrawal. Good to know that you might be asked questions about your experience in the trial, and you might be asked to do some specific tests or exams, and that's to ensure your safety with stopping the study. And then, as I mentioned before, you can request that any information you provided or that was collected about you and any samples be withdrawn from the study once you leave it. But again, that's a little bit dependent on the study itself. So again, I'll just reiterate that everything that I've talked to you about and more is on the Clinical Trials Ontario website. I'll also reiterate that while we're an Ontario-based organization, this information is really applicable to anyone in Canada who is participating in a clinical trial. And I'll just leave you with my email address and our website. I'm always really happy for you after the fact. If you think of any questions, I'm always one of those people. Like, I might not necessarily think of a question right now, but post webinar, I might have a question. So feel free to either let Jeff know what questions you have or just reach out to me directly. I'm totally fine with that. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I see that there's some questions that have come in, and I'm going to ask Jeff to moderate for me. So hopefully I can answer some of those questions for you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dawn. That was really great and very informative. And we do have some questions that have come in live during your presentation today. And we also have some that were received ahead of time for those that submitted them in advance. So I'll start with one that came in advance, and that was, again, about the up-to-date lists around new and ongoing clinical trials. So you mentioned the using the Ontario website that you run that is applicable to from CTO that's available to anyone in Canada.
Yep.
Are there other sources of information about conducting clinical trials and how people can stay informed on what might be applicable or of interest for them?
Yep, that's a great question. So there's clinicaltrials.gov. Health Canada also has a clinical trial database. So they've basically got a list of clinical trials that have been approved for conduct in Canada. They'll often actually send people over to clinicaltrials.gov for more fulsome information, but Health Canada does have information on their site. And then I just wanted to let people know that I did a quick search yesterday. There are about 33 studies running in Canada on asthma right now. And I should have mentioned that while most of the studies in clinicaltrials.gov are clinical trials, there are also some observational studies that are listed there. And a large number were actually observational studies. So observational studies are different from clinical trials. This is where people are basically, they are asked questions via survey or questionnaire, and they're not provided an intervention that's going to affect them. So they're basically observed. That's why they're called observational studies. And sometimes people can be in observational studies for like a number of years or even decades. So I just wanted to mention that some of the studies will come up as observational studies.
Great, thanks, Dawn. And I'll also point out in the chat, there's been a couple of things that we've posted as well that might be of interest, including a link to Asthma Canada's webpage about clinical trials. So there's a number of ways that you can find that information. And I want to thank you, Dawn, for sharing that with us today. Another question that came in advance, which relates to one that was submitted live today as well, is around adverse events and reporting. So one of the questions was, what's the process in terms of reporting adverse events? And then one of the live attendees today had mentioned that she was taking an injection for 2 years now that might be related to recurrence of breast cancer. What would be sort of that course of action for anything related to adverse events? And if you can comment on any of those specifics that were mentioned as well.
Sure. So, related to clinical trials within the informed consent form, which I again kind of feel it's like for participants, it's your main document about participation. So, within the informed consent, there will be specific instructions about how to report any adverse events. And then the trial team themselves will also have specific instructions about what happens when adverse events are reported. In terms of being outside a clinical trial and feeling like there's some type of adverse event related to an intervention that's been approved by Health Canada for use, on the Health Canada website, there is a place where Canadians can report interventions. And Jeff, I can get back to you post the call where that actual reporting site is. And it's available for anyone in Canada to report to, as well as physicians report to it, et cetera. And that's part of, ongoing surveillance of different interventions after they've been approved to be on the market. So I can find that link for you and you can share it with your community as well.
Great, that's wonderful. Thank you, Don, for that. Another question that came in advance was around, and you touched on this a bit, around the barriers. You talked about there being advantages and risks to being involved with clinical trials. So what would you say are the largest barriers for patients to consider when face rather when joining a clinical trial?
So it's really interesting. I love this question. This is a great question. And at CTO, we actually did a study about almost 7 years ago now about Canadians' perceptions related to clinical trials. And at the time, we actually found that one of the biggest barriers was that people didn't know clinical trials were an option. And they just didn't know about them, or they had a high interest in participating once they knew about them. But they felt like their healthcare providers, and no offense to healthcare providers, but they were kind of gatekeepers. And I've actually heard this from people before who are really interested in participating, but that they've never been provided the opportunity to participate or didn't know where to look themselves to actually find a study. So that's what we found to be one of the biggest barriers, is that people actually don't know that they're an option. And then for some people, other barriers might be things as simple as, I don't live in an urban center. And we are trying to change what that looks like for people in Canada to hopefully provide evidence that Canadians are interested in participating in trials. And so helping investigators, researchers, and sponsors understand that, and helping them potentially build new ways that trials might be offered to people to participate who are outside of these big urban centers, but they're still interested in participating in studies. So as I mentioned, COVID kind of opened up the door on that front. And then for people, I've heard from other people, things like time, right? The time to participate, or the travel, or some of those things, which are personal to them. But for some people, depending on their situation, those can also present major barriers for participation.
Thank you very much, Don. And certainly, I don't think any of us would choose to have gone through the pandemic and all of its effects, but there are some silver linings coming out. One of which is, thinking outside the box in terms of how people participate, and particularly in a country as large as Canada, it's good to know that there are alternatives for people, particularly those that are living in more rural areas that don't have access to a site where trials might be taking place. So it's good to know that that's happening. There were a couple of questions that have come in around finding information about clinical trials in other provinces, and even one person asked about another country. In terms of finding Canadian-based studies and clinical trials that are happening right now, just reiterate the fact that the Clinical Trials Ontario website does have the ability to filter out not just Ontario results, but other provinces as well. So we encourage people to check that out. Also, clinicaltrials.gov And as far as other countries outside of Canada, Dawn, quickly, is there anything that you would recommend to people that are interested in learning more about what's happening in a more global sense?
Clinicaltrials.gov does have a number of global studies in it. It is a global database, so that would be one area. There's also another one, and again, I'll get you the link, Jeff, but the WHO does also have, I wouldn't call it a finder because it's more what they call a registry for trials that people want to register so that they can publish at a later date. But WHO does also have a registry. That's another big one. So I think those are kind of the big ones. And thanks, Jeff, for reminding me. I should have shared before that, yes, the CTO Finder will allow you to search any province, territory, or all of Canada. We've had some feedback about opening that up beyond Canada. So that might be something that we do in a future iteration too.
That's great. Thank you. And thanks for the leadership that you and CTO provide in that area. It's such a great resource, and we encourage everyone to connect with Clinical Trials Ontario, whether you're an Ontario resident or anyone across the country. Just a few minutes left before we close out our session today, and I just want to try to get to a couple of quick questions here. So one of them was about the person that's writing in says, how healthy do participants have to be involved in trials? She mentions the fact that she considers herself pretty fragile, but still wants to be involved. So I know this can vary greatly from trial to trial, but do you have any general comments about that?
Yeah, I think the main thing would be to scope out the phase 1 studies that you're interested in. If you're talking about being in a phase 1 study, otherwise, if it's a different type of study, I would just say, check out what the eligibility criteria are, what the exclusion criteria are, and contact the site team and have a chat with them. It's going to be, as you mentioned, Jeff, really different for each study. So I can't really give a general answer besides just take a look if you're interested in the study and contact the site team if it's worth a chat.
Yeah, to your point earlier too, the inclusion criteria should be very clear for reputable.
It will be. Yeah. But you may need help with that. So again, the team would always be willing to respond.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Just again, a couple minutes left, so we'll try and get a couple quick questions in here. So someone was asking about any planned phase 3 or 4 clinical trials that are aimed at working populations, where metrics might also include workplace areas such as absenteeism and so forth. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I can't comment specifically on that. Again, I would encourage you to have a look at the studies that are out there and see if there's anything that piques your interest there. I'm not aware of anything, but that doesn't mean that they're not being planned or happening.
Right. Okay, and then finally, and I apologize, we can't get to all of the questions, but there is one that I've seen that come in that I think will be a great value to everyone interested in clinical trials, and that's around how efficacy is determined. That, of course, can be different, whether we're talking about something involved in asthma. Lung function was mentioned here as a potential metric, but also what happens after the trial ends. So people interested in, particularly if they're involved in the clinical trial and they're seeing benefits for themselves personally, what typically happens around access to a drug once a clinical trial does end?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that should be something that you would have to ask questions on. It might be different for different studies, depending on who the sponsor, the investigator is, etc. Sometimes I've seen it happen in Canada where people have participated in phase 3 studies. And if it's an industry-run trial, I've seen them keep people on the specific intervention until it's been approved, given that the results were positive. That may not always happen though. So I don't want to give false hope around, that's going to happen. That definitely is a question to ask about, and ask about what the possibilities are around that if the results of the study are positive. And the investigator or sponsor seek formal approval at the end of those phase 3 studies in this case.
Great. Thank you, Dawn. And thank you so much for joining us today, Dawn, and for sharing your wealth of expertise. I've had the pleasure of working with you on a few different projects over the last several years. And I don't think we could have found a better presenter or more knowledgeable expert to speak and to address these questions. So we really appreciate it, Dawn.
Thank you.
On behalf of everyone here with Asthma Canada, as well as our community and others who might have joined us from other patient communities, in addition to the asthma community. Just as we close off today, I want to remind everyone that if you have questions, if you're looking for information related to this topic or anything around asthma as a patient, as a caregiver, a parent, whatnot, we're always here for you. So please reach out. You can see on the screen here our general information mailbox, info@asthma.ca. We also have a toll-free number that you can call anytime. When you call our asthma helpline, you'll be connected with a certified respiratory educator who can answer questions for you and can find additional resources for you depending on what it is that you're looking for. So encourage everyone to connect with us anytime. As I said, we're always here. And finally, also wanted to just mention that Asthma Canada is a registered charity. So if you find the work that we do and the information that we provide, sessions like this are helpful. If you are able to, we ask people to consider making a contribution to support our initiatives. And you can do so through our website, asthma.ca/donate. We appreciate all donations at any amount. So thank you for that. Thank you for considering it. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks again, Dawn, for such an excellent and informative webinar. Have a good day, everyone.